Three people told me this story. Separately. Years apart. None of them knew the others had talked. And not one of them, not a single one, told it the same way. I've been researching Bruce Lee for 2 years now. Not the legend. Not the posters, not the nunchucks, not the yellow jumpsuit. The man. The actual, breathing, sweating, sometimes wrong human being who lived for 32 years and left behind more questions than answers. And the more I dig, the more I find stories that don't add up. Stories where the facts slip sideways depending on who's holding them. This is one of those stories. 1967. A backstage corridor in a Hollywood television studio. A narrow concrete hallway, maybe 60 feet long, lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed like trapped insects. At one end, a 27-year-old martial arts instructor from Oakland. 135 pounds. Unknown. Uninvited to the party of American fame. He was there to do a demonstration on a talk show, a novelty act, a curiosity, the karate guy. At the other end, a bodyguard. 350 pounds. Ex-bouncer. Semi-professional wrestler. A man whose entire career was built on the simple, reliable fact that people looked at him and moved out of the way. What happened between them took about 10 seconds. 10 seconds. That's how long it takes to pour a cup of coffee. To tie a shoe. To check your phone and put it back in your pocket. 10 seconds is nothing. 10 seconds is a gap between heartbeats in a normal life. But these 10 seconds ended a man's career. Rewired another man's identity. And set off a chain of events that reached James Coburn, Hong Kong, and the entire future of martial arts in American cinema. 3 people saw it happen. 3 people told me what they saw. And I have spent 4 months trying to figure out which one of them is telling the truth. Here's what I know for certain. The bodyguard ended up on the floor. Everyone agrees on that. Bruce Lee walked away. Everyone agrees on that too. But the space between those two facts, the how, the mechanism, the actual event, that's where the story splinters into 3 different realities. I'm going to walk you through all 3 versions. I'm going to show you the contradictions. And then I'm going to tell you what I think actually happened, based on biomechanics, positioning, and the documented science of Bruce Lee's speed. But there's a detail in the 3rd version, the bodyguard's own account, that kept me awake for 2 nights. A detail that doesn't fit neatly into any explanation. We'll get there. And there's something else. Someone else in that corridor. Someone none of the 3 witnesses mention in their accounts. A man standing about 20 feet away, watching the whole thing with an expression that never changed. I'll get to him too. First, I need to take you back to 1967. Back to that corridor. Back to the fluorescent buzz and the smell of concrete dust and stale coffee. Because to understand what happened in those 10 seconds, you need to feel what that hallway felt like. You need to stand in it. Let me put you there. Hollywood in 1967 was a machine. A vast, grinding, smoke-breathing machine that ran on confidence, connections, and the absolute certainty that it knew what an audience wanted. The studio system was fracturing but hadn't collapsed yet. Television was king and television was hungry. Every week, talk shows needed guests, needed segments, needed something to fill the space between commercials. A martial arts demonstration fit that need the way a juggler or a trained dog might. It was filler. It was exotic. It was the 5 minutes before the real guest came on. Bruce Lee understood this. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what slot he occupied in the hierarchy of American entertainment in 1967, somewhere between a novelty act and a curiosity. The Chinese guy who could do things with his hands. He'd had a brief taste of television, a role on the Green Hornet that had given him a flicker of visibility and then guttered out when the show was cancelled. He was back to teaching martial arts in a small school. Back to giving demonstrations when invited. Back to waiting. And he was very, very good at waiting. The studio that day was like every studio of its era. A public face of polished floors and painted flats, and behind it, the reality, concrete corridors that smelled of electrical cables and the peculiar staleness of air that had been recycled through the same building for decades. The backstage area was a network of these corridors. Low ceilings. Fluorescent lights, some of them steady, some of them flickering with that irregular pulse that crawls into the back of your skull. The floor was bare concrete, scuffed and stained. Cables ran along the base of the walls in thick bundles, taped down with gaffer tape that had been there so long it had turned the color of old skin. The sound backstage was layered. On one side of the wall, the audience was warming up, that low collective murmur that sounds like the ocean if the ocean were indoors and slightly impatient. Someone was testing a microphone, and the pop-pop-pop of the sound check bled through the walls in dull, arrhythmic thuds. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine gurgled. The air was warm. Stage lights on the other side of the wall pushed heat through concrete like a low fever. Bruce arrived early. He wore a dark jacket, dark pants, simple shoes. He carried nothing. No bag, no equipment, no entourage. He walked the corridor alone, found his designated area, a stretch of wall near a cable trunk where someone had balanced a styrofoam cup, and he stood. Hands at his sides. Still. Not restless, not checking a watch, not looking for someone to talk to. Just present. Centered in a way that looked, to anyone passing, like a man with nowhere to be. But it wasn't that. It was the opposite. He was exactly where he intended to be, and he was occupying that space completely. If you'd walked past him, you might not have noticed him at all. 5'7". 135 pounds. In 1967 backstage Hollywood, an Asian man standing quietly by a wall was furniture. He was scenery. He was someone else's assistant, or a caterer who'd gotten turned around, or a tourist who had somehow slipped past security. He was not, in the visual grammar of that world, a guest. He was not talent. He was not someone who belonged. This is not an accusation. This is architecture. The architecture of assumption in 1967 America, where the shape of your face and the size of your body told people a story before you opened your mouth. Bruce Lee knew this architecture intimately. He had been navigating it since he arrived in the United States at 18 years old. He had been misread in every room he'd entered for nearly a decade. He had learned to use it. Now. The Bodyguard. His name doesn't matter. Not because I'm protecting him, but because his name isn't the point. What matters is what he was, 350 pounds of professional intimidation. He'd been a bouncer in Los Angeles for 6 years before he got the Bodyguard job. 6 years of standing in front of doors at clubs where the people inside were more important than the people outside, and his job was to make that distinction physical. He was good at it. Not because he was violent, he rarely had to be. He was good at it because of geometry. When you are 6'4" and 350 pounds and you stand in a doorway, the doorway disappears. You become the door. People understood this instinctively. They looked at him and their bodies made a decision before their brains caught up. They stepped aside. They waited. They found another entrance. He'd been in fights, of course. Bar fights, mostly. The kind of shapeless grappling that happens at 2 a.m. between men who've had too much to drink and too little to prove. He'd won all of them, though one is a generous word for what usually happened. He showed up, the other person reassessed, and the situation resolved itself. His record was less a testament to skill than to simple physics. Mass wins. That was the law he lived by. Mass wins, and he had more of it than anyone. The Bodyguard gig was a step up. Better money. Better clubs. A famous client whose name opened doors that were already open and closed doors that needed closing. His job was simple: be visible, be large, be the reason people didn't try. He wore dark suits that strained across his shoulders. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him. He had a face that had been rearranged slightly by old impacts, a nose that listed to the left, a scar through one eyebrow, and these imperfections were assets. They were proof. They said, without words, that he had been in the place where hitting happens and he had come out the other side still standing. He was not evil. He was not malicious. He was a man doing a job that required a specific kind of presence, and he had that presence. In a different world, under different circumstances, he might have been perfectly pleasant. He might have held doors for people and asked about their day and laughed at their jokes. But this wasn't that world. This was Backstage Hollywood in 1967, and he was on the clock, and his famous client was somewhere in the building, and he was doing what he always did, occupying space. Being the biggest thing in whatever room he stood in. Making sure everyone knew it. He came around a corner in the corridor and saw Bruce Lee. What he saw, what his brain processed in the first half second, was a small Asian man standing alone by a wall. And in the filing system of his experience, there was exactly one category for this: someone who shouldn't be here. Not a threat. Not a guest. Not even a person, really, in the way that the word person implies agency and relevance. Just an obstacle. A misplaced thing. Something to be moved or redirected so the corridor could serve its proper function, which was to be empty for important people. He walked toward Bruce. His footsteps were heavy on the concrete, not dramatic, just heavy. 350 pounds doesn't tiptoe. The fluorescent light caught the sheen of his suit jacket, stretched tight across shoulders that were wider than some door frames. Bruce didn't move. Didn't shift his weight. Didn't look up with concern or look away with deference. He just watched the bodyguard approach with an expression that would have been difficult to read even if you'd been standing 2 feet away. The bodyguard stopped in front of him. Close. Closer than conversation required. Close enough that the size difference became a physical argument. I am here, you are small, this corridor belongs to me. You lost, buddy? 3 words. Casual. Dismissive. The verbal equivalent of a hand wave. Not aggressive, that's important. Not a threat. A dismissal. Which, in its way, was worse. A threat acknowledges that the other person might be dangerous. A dismissal says they're not even worth threatening. What happened next, the physical contact that started it, is where the accounts begin to diverge. One witness says it was a shoulder check. Another says the bodyguard put a hand on Bruce's chest. A third says it was just the bodyguard stepping forward into Bruce's space, using his mass to push without pushing. The mechanism doesn't matter. What matters is the message: move. Bruce spoke. Once. Clearly. Politely. The words aren't recorded, no one remembers the exact phrase. Something like "excuse me" or "I'm a guest on the show." Something civil. Something that, in a rational world, would have resolved the situation. The bodyguard laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was a reflexive laugh, the laugh of a man who has heard something so far outside his reality that his brain defaults to humor. A 135-pound Asian man telling a 350-pound bodyguard that he belongs here. In 1967. Backstage. That's funny. That's a joke the universe is telling. Bruce didn't ask again. And now we're in the 10 seconds. The 10 seconds that no one can agree on. The 10 seconds that I've spent 4 months trying to reconstruct from 3 contradictory accounts, second-hand interviews, and the biomechanical research of people who study what happens when a human fist moves faster than a human eye can track. I need to tell you what happened after those 10 seconds first. Because everyone agrees on the after. It's the during that fractures. After, the bodyguard was on the floor. On the concrete. On his back, or maybe on his side, the accounts vary on the position, but not on the fact. 350 pounds of professional intimidation, horizontal. His eyes were open. He was conscious. But he wasn't getting up. Not because he couldn't. Because something had happened to the connection between his brain and his legs, and the signal to stand wasn't arriving. After, Bruce Lee was standing. In the same spot. Or very close to the same spot. His breathing was normal. His hands were at his sides. His expression hadn't changed. He looked, to anyone who hadn't just witnessed the previous 10 seconds, like a man who had been standing there quietly the whole time. After, silence. But not real silence. Backstage is never silent. The fluorescent tubes still buzzed. The audience murmur still bled through the wall. The coffee machine still gurgled in its alcove down the hall. What was silent was the human layer. The breathing had changed. The 2 or 3 people in visual range had stopped making voluntary sound. No speech. No movement. No cough or shuffle or clearing of throats. Just the mechanical sounds of a building that didn't know anything had happened, and the biological sounds of humans who knew something had, and couldn't process what. 4,000 watts of fluorescent light. The faint smell of ozone. And a space in the air where a confrontation used to be, now replaced by the particular emptiness that follows when something happens too fast for the brain to file it properly. Bruce stepped over the bodyguard. Or around him. He walked down the corridor in the direction he'd been heading before the interruption. He didn't look back. He didn't speak. He didn't adjust his jacket or shake out his hand or do any of the things that people do after a physical confrontation. He just continued. As if the 350-pound obstacle on the floor was a puddle. An inconvenience of terrain. Something you step over and forget. The bodyguard stayed on the floor for what witnesses estimate was somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds. A long time to be on a floor when you're a man whose job is to be the most upright person in any room. He got up eventually. Slowly. He leaned against the wall. He didn't follow Bruce. He didn't call out. He didn't do anything. He just leaned against the concrete and breathed, and something behind his eyes was rearranging itself, a filing system collapsing, categories dissolving, the architecture of his self-understanding quietly imploding. That's the after. Everybody agrees on the after. Now I need to show you the during. 3 times. 3 different ways. Because 3 people were standing within 30 feet of each other, and 3 people saw 3 completely different events. I've arranged them in the order I found them. Version 1. The Stage Manager. His name appears in a 1989 issue of a television industry magazine, not a martial arts publication, not a celebrity tabloid, a trade magazine for people who work in television production. He gave a short interview about strange things he'd witnessed backstage over a 30-year career. This was one of them. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, near the entrance to the stage left wing. His job was tracking the schedule, making sure guests were in position, making sure segments ran on time, making sure the machinery of live television kept grinding forward. He was holding a clipboard. He was partially turned away from Bruce and the bodyguard. He'd been checking something on his schedule when the confrontation started. He heard voices but didn't look up immediately. Backstage voices were constant. They were background. You only looked up when the tone changed. The tone changed. He didn't hear a shout or a threat. He heard the bodyguard laugh, that short, dismissive bark. And then he heard a sound. This is what he said in the interview, and I'm going to give it to you as close to verbatim as the source allows. I heard a sound like a heavy bag hitting the floor. Not a slap. Not a punch sound. A thud. A heavy thud. Like something big and dense hitting concrete. I turned around and the big guy was on the ground. The Chinese guy was standing exactly where he'd been standing before. I didn't see him move. I literally did not see movement. The big guy was up, then he was down, and the small guy hadn't moved. That's what I saw. I know it doesn't make sense. He repeated that last sentence twice in the interview. I know it doesn't make sense. As if he'd been saying it to himself for 22 years and had never resolved it. Let me reconstruct his visual experience. He was positioned at the far end of the corridor, at least 30 feet away. He was at an angle, not directly facing the confrontation, but offset, looking down the corridor at roughly a 45-degree line. When he heard the thud and turned, his eyes went to the source of the sound, the bodyguard, now on the floor. His brain then looked for the cause. The cause should have been visible: a person in motion, a fist retracting, a body shifting out of a strike. But there was nothing. Bruce was still. His hands were down. His feet were planted. There was no residual motion, no follow-through, no evidence that a physical action had just occurred. The stage manager's brain did what brains do when presented with an effect without a visible cause: it edited. It concluded that somehow, it had missed the event. It filed the memory under "impossible thing I saw" and moved on. He told the story at dinner parties for the next 30 years. Nobody believed him. We'll come back to that. Now, I need to pause here. Because there's a problem with this version. If Bruce Lee didn't visibly move, if his hands were at his sides and his feet were planted, how did a 350-pound man end up on concrete? There are only a few possibilities. 1. The stage manager missed the strike because he turned too late and the strike was already over. 2. Bruce used a technique that didn't require visible gross motor movement, a subtle strike, a pressure point, something that looked like stillness from 30 feet away. 3. The bodyguard fell on his own. And that third option sounds absurd until you hear version 3. But we're not there yet. Version 2. The crew member. This account surfaces in a 1992 issue of a martial arts magazine. It's secondhand. The crew member told a friend, the friend told the magazine. An extra layer of transmission, which means an extra layer of potential distortion. But the core details have the specificity of first-hand observation, and they contradict version 1 in a way that is either illuminating or maddening, depending on your tolerance for ambiguity. The crew member was closer than the stage manager. Maybe 15 feet away. And he was facing the confrontation more directly. He'd been walking down the corridor toward Bruce and the bodyguard when the situation developed. He stopped when he saw the bodyguard step into Bruce's space. He watched. Here's what he reported: Bruce hit him. Fast, like a snake. One shot. The big guy folded. Not like in the movies where the guy flies back. He just folded. Knees buckled, went straight down. Like someone turned off the power. Bruce stepped over him and kept walking. Didn't even look back. This version is clear. Unambiguous. Bruce threw a strike. One strike. It was fast. The snake comparison suggests a linear, darting motion rather than a wide swing. The bodyguard didn't fly backward, didn't stumble, didn't stagger. He folded. Vertically. Knees buckling, body dropping straight down, as if the structural support of his legs had been suddenly removed. This is consistent with a specific type of strike to a specific set of targets. A blow to the solar plexus can cause the diaphragm to spasm, the legs to buckle, and the body to drop vertically. A strike to the liver, the right side of the body, just below the ribs, can cause an overwhelming wave of pain and nausea that shuts down motor control before the conscious brain even registers the impact. Fighters who've taken liver shots describe exactly this: not being knocked backward, but folding. Going straight down. The power turned off. But here's the contradiction. The stage manager says Bruce didn't move. The crew member says Bruce threw a clearly visible strike. They were in the same corridor. They were within 15 feet of each other. One of them is wrong. Or, and this is where it gets interesting, both of them are right, from where they were standing. I'll come back to that. Because first, you need to hear version 3. The one that kept me up at night. Version 3. The Bodyguard. This is the hardest account to source. It comes from a 2003 interview, not with the bodyguard himself, but with a friend. Someone he confided in years after the incident. Another layer of separation, another filter. But the emotional texture of this account is so specific, so granular, so unlike anything a secondhand source would invent, that I believe the core of it is authentic. People don't fabricate details like these. They remember them, or they don't tell them at all. The bodyguard's account, as relayed by his friend: he looked at me. That's all. He looked at me and I knew. I've been in 100 fights. I've been hit by guys bigger than me. But nobody ever looked at me like that. My legs went out. Not because he hit me, I don't think he hit me. My body just decided to go down. Like my legs made a decision without asking my brain. I sat on the floor and he walked past me. He never touched me. Let that sit for a second. A man whose professional identity was built on physical dominance. A man who had been in, by his own estimation, 100 fights. A man whose body was his credential, his authority, his argument. And he is saying that a 135-pound man looked at him, and his legs stopped working. No contact. No strike. No physical mechanism. Just a look. And then collapse. This version is the most disturbing of the three, because it suggests something that exists outside the normal framework of combat. It suggests that Bruce Lee didn't need to hit this man. That something in Bruce's eyes, or his stillness, or his presence, communicated a threat so absolute, so primal, so far beyond the bodyguard's experience, that his autonomic nervous system bypassed his conscious mind and chose the only response it had for a predator it couldn't fight: shutdown. Collapse. Surrender at the neurological level. The bodyguard's description of his legs making a decision without asking his brain is consistent with what neurologists call a vasovagal response triggered by extreme acute stress. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve, running from the brainstem through the neck, chest, and abdomen, can, under certain conditions of sudden overwhelming fear, cause an immediate drop in heart rate and blood pressure. The blood drains from the brain. The legs give out. The person drops. It looks, from the outside, like fainting. But it's not fainting. It's the body making a survival decision without consulting the conscious mind. It happens to soldiers. It happens to assault victims. It happens to people who encounter a threat so far outside their framework that the brain essentially crashes, and the body defaults to the most primitive survival program it has: go down, go limp, don't be a target. Could Bruce Lee's gaze have triggered this? Could the bodyguard, who had spent his entire career calibrated to read threat levels, who was, in a sense, a professional assessor of danger, have looked at Bruce Lee and received a signal so far off his scale that his system failed? Maybe. The literature supports it as a possibility. The bodyguard's own words support it. But I don't think that's what happened. Not entirely. Because there's still the crew member, 15 feet away, who says he saw a strike. And here's the thing I've been holding back about version 3. The detail that doesn't quite fit. The bodyguard, from the floor, looking up and past Bruce Lee, saw someone. A man standing about 20 feet down the corridor. Tall. Well-dressed. Expensive jacket. Not moving. Not reacting. Not stepping forward to help, not stepping backward in alarm. Just standing there with his arms crossed or his hands in his pockets. The bodyguard's memory is unclear on the specifics, and watching. With an expression that the bodyguard later described, through his friend, as like he was watching a science experiment. Not shock. Not excitement. Not fear. Scientific interest. As if the man had been waiting to see exactly this, not a fight, but a proof of concept. I know who that man was. And I'll tell you. But first, I need to show you what actually happened in those 10 seconds. Because I think I've figured it out. 3 versions. 1 corridor. 1 10-second event. 3 completely irreconcilable memories. Except they're not irreconcilable. Not if you understand 3 things: positioning, speed, and the neurology of perception under stress. Let me start with positioning. I've reconstructed the corridor based on studio layouts of the era and the details embedded in each account. The corridor runs roughly north-south. Bruce was standing along the east wall, near a cable trunk, facing south. The bodyguard approached from the south, walking north. This means the confrontation happened along a north-south axis. The stage manager was at the north end of the corridor, near the stage left wing entrance. He was at an angle offset to the west, looking south-southeast. His line of sight to the confrontation was partially obscured by the cable trunk and by the angle of approach. He was the farthest away, at least 30 feet. The crew member was closer. 15 feet. And he was walking south, which means he was approaching the confrontation more or less head-on. His line of sight was better, more direct, less obstructed. The bodyguard was, obviously, at the point of contact. His perspective was the most immediate and the most physiologically compromised. Now, speed. Bruce Lee's hand speed has been documented by multiple independent sources across his career. Film crews shooting at 24 frames per second, the standard for cinema, reported that his strikes didn't register on film. They would appear in one frame with his hand at rest, and in the next frame, the strike was complete. No motion blur. No in-between. This means the strike traveled from initiation to completion in less than 1/24th of a second. Less than 42 milliseconds. 42 milliseconds. The human eye requires roughly 150 to 200 milliseconds to register and process a new visual event. Bruce Lee's fastest strikes were 3 to 4 times faster than the human eye's processing speed. This is not mythology. This is not fan worship. This is documented by camera operators, by martial arts researchers, and by the physiological measurements conducted on Bruce during his lifetime. His 1-inch punch, a strike delivered from 1 inch away, generated enough force to launch a man backward. His sidekick was measured at over 300 pounds of force. And his straight lead, his primary combat weapon, was, by every available measurement, invisible to the naked eye at full speed. Now take that speed and place it in the corridor. Bruce throws a strike. A single, linear strike, probably a straight lead or a short hook, targeting either the vagus nerve cluster on the side of the bodyguard's neck or the solar plexus. The strike travels from Bruce's center line to the target in less than 42 milliseconds. The crew member, 15 feet away, facing the confrontation more or less directly, catches it. Barely. He sees fast, like a snake. He sees a movement. He may not see the details of the strike, the fist, the trajectory, the point of contact, but he sees something. A blur. A flash. His brain fills in the rest and files it as Bruce hit him. One shot. The stage manager, 30 feet away, at an angle, partially obstructed, turns at the sound of the impact. But by the time his eyes reach the scene, a process that takes his head approximately 200 to 300 milliseconds to complete, the strike is already over. Bruce's hand is back. His body is still. There is no residual motion. What the stage manager sees is the aftermath, a man on the floor and another man standing still. His brain searches for a cause and finds none. He concludes, honestly and accurately from his perspective, that Bruce didn't move. And the bodyguard. 350 pounds. At the point of contact. What happened to him is the most interesting of all. A precise strike to the vagus nerve cluster, the bundle of nerves on the lateral side of the neck, just below the jaw, causes immediate vasovagal syncope. Blood pressure drops. Heart rate plummets. The legs lose structural integrity. The body drops. The conscious brain, which was occupied with the process of confrontation, posture, aggression, dominance signaling, doesn't register the strike as a strike. It doesn't process the impact in the way a punch to the jaw is processed, where there's pain, there's recoil, there's a clear cause and effect chain. Instead, the experience is of sudden systemic failure. The legs stop working. The floor arrives. And the conscious mind, searching for an explanation, finds only the last thing it was processing before the system crashed: the look. Those eyes. The stillness. The bodyguard's brain didn't lie to him. It told him exactly what it experienced. A man looked at him, and his body shut down. What it couldn't tell him, because the event was faster than consciousness, was that between the look and the shutdown, there was a fist. 24 frames per second. In 10 seconds, that's 240 frames. Somewhere in those 240 frames, there is a single frame, maybe two, where a fist is traveling from Bruce Lee's centerline to the bodyguard's neck. One frame in 240. The stage manager blinked and missed it. A camera would have missed it. The bodyguard's own nervous system missed it. That's what 10 seconds looks like when one of the people in them is Bruce Lee. 3 versions. All 3 are true. All 3 are incomplete. The stage manager saw the aftermath. The crew members saw the motion. The bodyguard felt the result. Put them together, like three angles of the same photograph, and you get something close to the whole picture, a strike so fast that it existed in the space between perception and reality, visible only from the right angle, at the right distance, to eyes that happened to be looking at the right moment. 135 pounds of precision against 350 pounds of assumption. Now, the man in the corridor. The one watching from 20 feet away. The one the bodyguard saw from the floor, standing with an expression like he was watching a science experiment. His name was James Coburn. Coburn was 40 years old in 1967. He'd been in Hollywood for over a decade. He was a star, not the biggest, but established, respected, bankable. He'd been in The Magnificent Seven. He'd been in The Great Escape. He played tough guys with a certain laconic intelligence, men who communicated more with their eyes than with their mouths. He was tall, lean, and he carried himself with the economy of a man who understood that presence was more effective than noise. He was backstage that day for the same show. Not the same segment, he was there for a separate appearance, a promotional spot, something forgettable. But he'd arrived early, and he was in the corridor, and he saw the whole thing. He didn't intervene. He didn't call out. He didn't step forward. He didn't react visibly at all, as far as anyone can tell. He just watched. What Coburn saw was not a fight. He knew what fights looked like, he'd choreographed them, acted in them, studied them for years. What he saw was something else. Something he'd been looking for without fully knowing he was looking for it. Proof that combat could be scientific. That efficiency could replace aggression. That a human body, trained to a certain level of precision, could render size and strength irrelevant. Not in theory. Not in a movie. In a concrete corridor with fluorescent lights and the smell of old coffee, against a man who outweighed the victor by 215 pounds. Coburn had been hearing about Bruce Lee. Fragments. Rumors in the martial arts community that had begun to cross over into the entertainment world. A man in Los Angeles who taught a different kind of fighting. A man who was fast in a way that didn't quite fit the category of fast. Coburn was curious. He was a collector of competence, a man drawn to mastery in any form. And what he saw in that corridor wasn't just mastery. It was proof. He didn't approach Bruce that day. He watched Bruce step over the bodyguard and walk down the corridor and disappear around a corner. He watched the bodyguard sit on the floor and lean against the wall and stare at nothing. And then Coburn put his hands in his pockets and walked away. But he'd made up his mind. Within 2 weeks, he contacted Bruce Lee. He didn't ask for a demonstration. He didn't ask for references. He asked for private lessons. And he offered $275 an hour. $275 an hour in 1967. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $2,000 an hour in today's money. For a martial arts lesson from a man who, at that point, had no film career, no public reputation, no credentials that Hollywood would have recognized. Coburn was paying for what he'd seen in the corridor. He was paying for 10 seconds. But that's a different story. And it's the next one I'm going to tell. For now, I want to stay in that corridor. Because the 10 seconds are over, and the years are about to begin, and what happened to the people in that hallway didn't stay in that hallway. The bodyguard quit his job within 6 months. Not because of injury, the vasovagal response, if that's what it was, would have resolved within minutes. He wasn't hurt. Not physically. But something else had happened to him. Something structural. Something in the architecture of who he believed himself to be. For his entire adult life, he had been the biggest person in the room. That was his identity. That was his resume, his credential, his value proposition. When he walked into a space, the geometry of that space rearranged itself around him. People moved. Conversations shifted. Eye contact dropped. He was the gravitational center, and everything else orbited. This wasn't arrogance, it was experience. It was 1,000 repetitions of the same result. He was large, people deferred, the system worked. And then a man half his size, less than half his size, had put him on a concrete floor in the time it takes to blink, and he hadn't even felt it happen. The system didn't work. The system had never worked. It had only worked in rooms where no one present happened to have the specific capability to dismantle it. And now he knew that. He knew it in his legs, which had betrayed him. He knew it in his back, which remembered the concrete. He knew it in the part of his brain that had been reorganizing itself since the moment he looked up at a fluorescent ceiling and realized he didn't understand how he'd gotten there. He tried to go back to work. He stood in doorways. He wore the dark suits. He clasped his hands in front of him and presented the same wall of flesh and scar tissue and implied violence that had worked for years. But something was different. Not in the way he looked. He was still 350 pounds, still 6'4", still a man whose shadow arrived before he did. The difference was behind his eyes. He knew the secret now. The secret was that size was a story. A convincing story, a useful story, a story that worked in almost every room, but a story. And stories can be interrupted by someone who doesn't believe in them. He started flinching. Not visibly, not in any way that a client or a colleague would have noticed. But internally, every time someone approached him, there was a microsecond of recalibration. A question that had never existed before: what if this one can do it too? What if this one knows what the small Chinese man knew? What if this person, approaching from the left, the right, the front, is carrying within their quiet body the same invisible thing that put me on a floor? The question was corrosive. It ate at the foundation. By the 3rd month, he was drinking more. By the 4th month, he was calling in sick. By the 6th month, he was done. He told his employer he was moving to a different line of work. He didn't say why. He didn't have the vocabulary for why. How do you explain to someone that you stopped being a bodyguard because a man half your size looked at you and your legs quit? How do you explain that in a world that still measured danger in pounds and inches? He drifted for a while. Took jobs that didn't require physical intimidation. Bounced between cities. The story followed him, not publicly, not in any way that would have been traceable, but internally. It was the first thing he thought about when he woke up and the last thing he thought about before he slept. Not the pain. There was no pain. The mystery. The absolute, gnawing mystery of what had happened to him in that corridor. Years passed. Bruce Lee became famous. Became a global phenomenon. The bodyguard watched from whatever room he was in as the small man from the corridor became the most recognizable martial artist on the planet. He watched the big boss. He watched Fists of Fury. He watched Enter the Dragon. And every time he saw Bruce on screen throwing a kick, launching a man across a room, moving with that liquid, impossible speed, he felt his legs remember the concrete. Not the floor. The decision. The moment when his body had chosen, without permission, to stop being vertical. And here's the detail that I found in the deepest layer of secondhand accounts, buried in a 2003 interview that was itself a reference to a conversation from the mid-1980s. The bodyguard, at some point in the early 70s, drove to Bruce Lee's school. He had the address. He'd looked it up. He didn't go there to confront Bruce. He didn't go there for revenge. He went there to learn. To understand. To find out what had been done to him and how, and whether the thing that had dismantled his identity could also, somehow, rebuild it. He got out of his car. Walked to the door. The school was closed. Not temporarily, permanently. Bruce was in Hong Kong. Had been for months. Was making movies. Was becoming something that a Backstage corridor in 1967 couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have believed. The bodyguard stood outside the closed door for a while. How long, nobody knows. The account doesn't say. But I think about that moment more than I think about the corridor. I think about a 350-pound man standing on a sidewalk in Los Angeles, looking at a locked door, understanding that the only person who could explain what had happened to him was on the other side of the Pacific Ocean and would never know he'd come. He went back to his car. He drove away. And as far as the record shows, he never tried again. There's a silence in that image. Not the dramatic silence of a backstage corridor, not the electric silence of a confrontation. A quiet silence. A private one. The silence of a man realizing that the thing that broke him was also the only thing that could have fixed him, and that the window for both had closed while he wasn't looking. The stage manager had a different kind of aftermath. He didn't lose his job. He didn't have an identity crisis. He had something more mundane and, in its way, more frustrating, a true story that nobody believed. He told it at dinner parties. He told it at industry gatherings. He told it to friends, colleagues, bartenders, anyone who would listen. 135 pounds. 350 pounds. A backstage corridor. The big guy went down without the little guy moving. He told it the same way every time, with the same baffled honesty, the same admission that it didn't make sense. Nobody believed him. Not because they thought he was lying. Because the story violated the physics of their understanding. In 1967, in 1972, in 1980, the idea that a small Asian man could drop a 350-pound professional bodyguard without visibly moving was not a story. It was a fairy tale. It was the kind of thing people said when they'd had too many drinks or watched too many movies. Sure, pal. 135 pounds knocked out 350. Without moving. Have another scotch. He gave the interview in 1989, 22 years after the event. By then, Bruce Lee had been dead for 16 years. The legend had calcified. The mythology had hardened into something that was, paradoxically, both too big and too small for the truth. Too big because the myths were cartoonish. Bruce Lee could fly, Bruce Lee could kill with a touch, Bruce Lee was superhuman. Too small because the real thing, the actual thing he could do, was stranger and more specific than any myth. He could throw a punch that a camera couldn't capture and a nervous system couldn't register. That's not superhuman. That's human, taken to a place most humans don't know exists. The stage manager died, I don't know exactly when, the records are thin, with a true story lodged in his memory like a splinter. A thing he saw and couldn't explain and couldn't convince anyone else had happened. 30 years of telling the truth and being smiled at politely and dismissed. There's something in that. Something about the distance between witnessing and being believed. Something about how the most extraordinary things that happen in life are often the ones that sound the least credible, and how the people who see them are sentenced to a lifetime of being the crazy person at the dinner party. He wasn't crazy. He just saw something faster than his eyes could process, from an angle that denied him even the blur. He was a reliable witness to an unreliable event. And he spent 30 years paying the price for that. James Coburn. The man in the expensive jacket. The man who watched from 20 feet away with an expression like a scientist observing a hypothesis confirmed. Coburn didn't speak publicly about the corridor incident. Not in any interview I've been able to find. Not in any memoir or biographical account. Whatever he saw that day, he kept it to himself, or rather, he expressed it not through words but through action. Within 2 weeks of that evening, he had Bruce Lee's phone number. Within a month, he was taking private lessons. $275 an hour, twice a week, at Bruce's home or at a private training location in Los Angeles. In 1967, that was more than most Americans earned in a week. Coburn paid it without hesitation. He paid it the way you pay for a thing that you know, with absolute certainty, is worth more than the price. What happened in those private lessons, what Coburn learned, what Bruce taught, how a Hollywood star and a martial arts instructor from Hong Kong built a friendship that would reshape both of their lives, that's not this story. That's the next one. But I'll give you one thing. In 1999, 2 years before Coburn died, he gave an interview. By then he was 71 years old. He'd had a career that spanned 5 decades. He'd worked with the greatest directors, the greatest actors, the greatest stuntmen in the history of cinema. And when they asked him about Bruce Lee, he said this: "The first time I saw Bruce do something real, not a demonstration, not a performance, something real, I understood that everything I thought I knew about fighting was wrong. And I'd been in this business for 20 years. He didn't specify what something real was. He didn't describe a corridor or a bodyguard or a 10-second event. But the timeline fits. The language fits. Not a demonstration, not a performance. He wasn't talking about a martial arts showcase or a movie stunt. He was talking about a moment that wasn't planned, wasn't choreographed, wasn't performed for anyone's benefit. Something real. Something that happened because a 350-pound man blocked a corridor and a 135-pound man decided the corridor was no longer blocked. I think Coburn saw what the crew member saw. I think, from his angle 20 feet away, facing the confrontation more or less directly, he saw the strike. The single, impossibly fast strike that the stage manager missed and the bodyguard didn't feel. And I think what he understood in that moment was not just that Bruce Lee was fast. Not just that Bruce Lee was skilled. But that Bruce Lee had solved a problem that Coburn had been thinking about for 20 years in Hollywood, the problem of size versus precision, strength versus efficiency, the brute force model of combat versus something else. Something clean. Something scientific. Something that made 350 pounds irrelevant. That understanding cost him $275 an hour, twice a week, for years. He considered it the best money he ever spent. In that corridor, watching from the corner, was a man who didn't flinch once. His name was James Coburn. And he'd already made up his mind about Bruce Lee before anyone threw a punch. What he did next and what Bruce taught him behind closed doors at $275 an hour, that's a different story. And it's the next one I'm going to tell. But I want to end here. In the corridor. In 1967. The fluorescent light is still buzzing. It hasn't stopped, it won't stop until someone turns it off or it burns out, whichever comes first. The coffee on the cable trunk has gone cold. The audience on the other side of the wall is laughing at something, a joke, a pratfall, something that has nothing to do with what just happened in this hallway and everything to do with the world's talent for being entertained by the wrong thing at the wrong moment. There's a scuff on the concrete floor. A mark that might have been left by a 350-pound man going down, or might have been there before, or might be nothing. Concrete holds marks the way it holds temperature, indifferently, without opinion. Somewhere down the corridor, walking away, is a man who weighs 135 pounds. He is 27 years old. In 6 years, he will be the most famous martial artist who ever lived. In 6 years and 4 months, he will be dead. But he doesn't know either of those things yet. Right now, he's walking toward a stage where he will demonstrate some techniques for a television audience that will politely applaud and then forget about him by dinner. And somewhere behind him, leaning against a wall, is a man who weighs 350 pounds. He has not moved. He will not move for another minute, maybe 2. He is staring at the fluorescent light above him and feeling, for the first time in his adult life, the specific weight of his own body, not as an asset, not as a weapon, not as a credential, but as a thing he is trapped inside. A story he told himself for years that just ended mid-sentence. 10 seconds. That's all it was. 10 seconds in a corridor that smelled like concrete and coffee and old electrical tape. 10 seconds that ended one man's career, haunted another man's dinner parties, and started a relationship that would reshape Hollywood's understanding of what a human body could do. 10 seconds. And 3 people in the same corridor, standing in the same light, breathing the same warm air, who couldn't agree on what happened inside them. Maybe that's the truest thing about Bruce Lee. Not the speed. Not the power. Not the philosophy or the films or the legend. The truest thing is that he moved through the world at a frequency that most people couldn't perceive. He existed in the gaps between frames. In the space between a fist at rest and a fist that has already arrived. In the 10 seconds that 3 witnesses shared and none of them could agree on. He was there. He was real. And he was faster than the story anyone could tell about him. The corridor is empty now. The fluorescent light buzzes on. And somewhere, on a concrete floor that doesn't remember what fell on it, there is nothing. No mark. No evidence. No proof that any of this happened. Except 3 people who swore it did. And the one thing they all agreed on: the big man went down, and the small man kept walking. That's where this story ends. But it's also where the next one begins. Because in that corridor, watching from 20 feet away, a man named James Coburn had already picked up the phone in his mind. He just hadn't dialed yet. 2 weeks later, he would. And that call would change everything.